Jay, thank you so much for joining us today on the RevRx podcast. What a privilege it is to have you here on the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, sir. I first heard your name on another podcast. And in that podcast, you told your story of how you came to faith, how you came to believe in Christ. And um, it is a powerful story. And I'm thankful that God has done the work in you, that he has revealed himself to you. And I'm thankful for your voice, brother. We need your voice in this world that's becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity. We need you and the story that you're telling. And so I just want to say thank you for being here. And I'd love for you to just start off our time together introducing yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about who you are, your credentials, and where you find yourself today.
Yeah, well, so I grew up in Minnesota playing hockey, and that was my life. Spent all my time doing that. I dropped out of high school, slash graduated early, depending on how you look at it.
Sure.
I started doing homeschool my first month of my junior year, and then I took like a standardized test, and it said I was out of high school and in the major subjects. And so I got a job and I was playing hockey and doing that. I bounced around playing junior hockey for a few years. It's like a level between high school and college. That's where a lot of colleges recruit from. And so that was my goal and dream. And was doing that. And then went to college. I was really passionate about psychology because my mom took a psych course at one point when I was a kid and would tell us about it. I was just super fascinated about how we think and hearing some of the stuff she talked about from class. And so I knew that's what I wanted to go into. And so I was studying psychology in college and playing hockey. And that's when I kind of hit on apologetics. I was intrigued by religion, want to understand why people would believe something that I thought was pretty clearly false.
Hmm.
And so in just trying to understand that better, I wanted to avoid my own biases and look to see what, if any, claims are true. And that's where I discovered apologetics and realized, hey, this is the best explanation for the world. That seems true. And so became a Christian and then graduated from college, worked in the Air Force for a few years as a behavioral scientist. And then I was able to apply and get picked up for a program where they sent me to do a master's degree. And so I did that. My master's was in experimental psychology, although while I was there, they changed it to psychological sciences just to kind of fit more modern trends. And so my focus there was in kind of cognitive psychology, how we think, and specifically over the lifespan. And then taught for 3 years after that at the Air Force Academy. That was part of the program. They send you for a master's and then you teach. And then my commitment was up and just the state of the world and things that I'd wanted to really get into ministry. And so I decided to go to seminary. I went to Denver Seminary, did an apologetics degree. My wife couldn't pass down a half price education because they had a deal for half price for spouse. So she also did a master's in apologetics while we were there.
Awesome.
And so we got to do that together. So that was pretty fun. And then as I was finishing up my time there, or during the 3.5 years or so I was there, I just was feeling more and more that it would be good if we had more people doing apologetics, or at least someone with a PhD in psychology, and having that terminal degree would give more credibility, but also help train me a little bit better in understanding the field of psychology.
Sure.
And so I applied to some PhD programs, was able to get in. And so went into that kind of with the goal of not knowing what I was going to do with it, if it was going to be full-time ministry or teaching or research or something, but wanting to have that degree so I could work in things related to understanding why we believe what we believe in general, specifically with religion. And so did my PhD in social psychology at Baylor, and then got hired here at Northwestern College as a psych professor. And so now that's kind of my full-time thing, teaching here, and getting back into, now that my time's a little more free, doing some apologetic stuff and integrating the two, some stuff that I can use for class that I do outside of the classroom, and vice versa. So bringing in what I do in class or what I have time to research and bringing that into apologetics, focusing on that intersection between psychology and Christian faith generally, but mostly apologetics.
Yeah, I love that. Your story has been winding, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely not been a linear path.
And I see my story kind of the same way. And aren't you thankful for a God that navigates that with us and prepares the way?
Yep.
Um, yeah, you're kind of like the psychopologist nowadays.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very intrigued by that because as someone who understands those worlds, as a pastor and a pharmacist, the world where science meets faith, um,
Mhm.
I'm very intrigued by our thought life. Um, our thoughts are so important, and we're starting to see some scientific evidence coming to support a lot of that. And that's a different conversation for different today, but I'd love to for a different day, but I'd love to pick your brain about that sometime. But our thought life matters. Um, and what we believe matters. And, as someone who has been raised in the Bible Belt down here in the South, um, most of us are familiar and believe in Jesus because that's kind of what we grew up doing, right? Um, and I feel like that a lot of the rest of the country kind of looks down on that a little bit because they're like, oh, you can't think for yourself. Um, and so when I hear your story about the 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 area where our belief system and our thought process meets Christian faith. Like, I want to explore that. And so I'm excited for this time together. And I appreciate you kind of telling us where you come from. And you're right. I think that PhD in psychology, um, I think that sets you apart in the apologetics world because you understand how we think, how we believe, perhaps better than 99% of the country. And I'm excited to jump into that today. But I want before we get into that, I'd love to talk a little bit about how you were raised because I think maybe the way you were raised is a little different than how I was raised, and maybe some of my listeners. And so I think those formative years kind of they change the way that we see things and the way that we believe things. So can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and specifically any moments that stand out as far as being formative in your faith or pushing you away from faith, even?
Yeah. So when I was really young, they say the first 5 years of life or so, and obviously I don't remember some of that, but my grandparents lived about a mile away from us, and they were very religious, and so we went to church with them. I have still have some memories of being in the church and what it looks like and everything, and so um, that was a regular part of our life. At least on Sunday, we didn't really have many conversations. I remember my mom would pray with us before bed, but my grandparents moved away when I was 5, and then we pretty much stopped going to church. And then a few years later, we moved and then went to church a handful of times in the new place and had another Christmas and Easter thing. And then my dad died, committed suicide. And then we just kind of cut off from there. My mom, you know, went, blamed God for it and had a lot of problems with that. And so we just completely separated. So I didn't go to church at all anymore after that. A handful of times as a teenager, I'd sleep over at a friend's house on Saturday and they went to church. So I went with them, but that was it. It was um, no commitment or anything there. And actually, um, during my teen years, our family even drifted farther away. We didn't really ever talk about God, but um, we sort of lived in a way that was pretty opposed to that. So we would have Playboy or Penthouse magazines in the living room on the coffee tables. I could see, and that was there growing up, and so it was definitely a different ethic than a Christian ethic. We very much a common saying in my house is if it feels good, do it kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, that was most of what my childhood, teen years was like, is that sort of mentality. Um, and never really gave much thought to God or belief in God. And just what I picked up from culture was sort of, yeah, this is people believe different things and they're contradictory. And so it's false. And that was it until I got to college and really started looking at it myself.
Yeah. You described that moment um, when your mom kind of blamed God for your dad's death. That's a pretty common thing, isn't it? In our world, when we see bad things happen, we have this existential question of, how can a good God allow such bad things to happen? Was there a wrestling with that growing up, or was that just kind of straightforward? That's how it was. If God was God, then He wouldn't allow this to happen, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I actually viewed it as a good thing because my dad was abusive toward the whole family, and
Gotcha.
I was 10 when he died, or it was a couple weeks before my 10th birthday, so I was pretty young and didn't maybe have some of those questions. Um, Saw it as beneficial, so it didn't bother me on that end. But my mom, some of that came from her from talking about it with her later, so I don't know the degree and how she wrestled with that um, herself. But what we see in the research is when hardships happen to people, when they're Christian or not Christian, sometimes that will really strengthen their beliefs and they dig in deeper. But sometimes it leads them to changing their beliefs as well. And so you kind of, depending on a variety of different factors, it can go either way for people.
That's right. That's right. And we all face hardships to some degree, but those can be important as we formulate our belief system. So you mentioned that that was the case until you got into college. Um, and can you walk us through a little bit about when you started becoming, I don't know, maybe interested in Christianity, and kind of what level of interest that was? Was it intellectual? Was it curiosity? What first kind of drew you to the Christian faith, and then kind of how you approached that?
So I was largely indifferent toward Christianity. I mean, it was more what the religion I was most familiar with just because growing up in the US, right? That's by far the dominant religion.
Right.
So my interest was more psychology, religion, like why do people believe this sort of thing? And so I remember explicitly sitting in class and learning about confirmation bias and how, when we seek evidence for what we believe, we typically find what we're looking for, and then we can rationalize and justify that belief. And so that was like an aha moment for me for
Yeah.
like, that's so cool. It's such an amazing thing that our minds work this way. And so I want to be careful in my life to avoid it. And so
Sure.
fast forward several months or a year or so later, I was um, wanting to understand religion. I was really excited. I was going to be taking a psychology religion course. So I was really excited for that. So that's where I was kind of in that mindset. Okay, let me figure out what, if anything, is true about this.
Hmm.
And so I was looking at different religions, primarily atheism, because that's kind of where I was. I was sort of at that point. I was maybe back and forth between atheism and deism. One day you might ask me, does God exist? And I probably would have said no. And another day you ask me, I would say, yeah, there's maybe some sort of God that sort of created the world, but that's it. Maybe just wants us to be good people. And
Sure.
so I was kind of on that line. Easily could have gone either way from day to day. Um, but my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was a Christian. And so, those conversations we had, it came up. I would sometimes go to church with her when I was home from hockey. And so when I was looking into different religions, atheism, looking at that, she was able to recommend some apologetics books. She actually didn't know much apologetics. She, had a little bit of training. Didn't really even know what the word was, but knew of some different people in that area. And so, um, I started reading. I started with the Case for Christ books
Mm.
because I'd heard from her, from other people about some guy who tried to disprove Christianity and became a Christian. And so that's
Hmm.
what I Googled because I didn't know the name of the book. No one knew it. This was back around
Yeah.
2005. So, we had the internet, but we didn't have all the podcasts and resources we have now. And so
Right.
uh, I Googled that vague sentence, and Case for Christ popped up and was like, ah, it seems like the one I've been hearing about from different people. And so I'll
Sure.
read that. And so I read that one, read his other ones, um, felt like, okay, maybe it's a decent case, but that's where, again, my kind of wanting to avoid that confirmation bias kept in. And so,
Sure.
I spent more time after that looking into kind of refutations of that, looking particularly at atheists. So I thought, atheists, philosophers, and scientists would be the most rational, unbiased people.
Mm.
And so I wanted to see how they responded to those types of arguments. Um, and what I found in doing that was that they actually weren't as good. They weren't able to refute those arguments. Their responses weren't as in depth or coherent. And so I was a bit shocked with that because I thought for sure, the Christians were using old, outdated information or bending the truth a little bit here and there, because I was, pretty skeptical of Christians, and my mindset of Christianity was that of like the prosperity gospel preacher who's trying to get people out of their money. And so I was pretty
Manipulative. Yeah.
surprised. Yeah. um what I found when I looked at the arguments. And so after going through and evaluating those, I came to the conclusion that Christianity's almost certainly true.
Mm.
It makes a lot more sense than the alternatives. And so I
Yeah.
decided to commit my life to being a Christian.
It's beautiful. And I love the way that you approached it, because you approached it in a very objective way.
I tried to.
Yeah, yeah.
Some people would argue otherwise, but that was
Well,
the point.
yeah, the best you could. Like you made a concerted effort. That's the
Mhm.
biggest thing, because confirmation bias is real. Two people with the very different viewpoints can look at the same information and come away with two very different ideas, and a large part of that is, I guess, confirmation bias. Not telling you anything. You have a doctorate in this, but I'm just, for my listeners out there. Um, we tend to find things we're looking for, and we tend to be able to kind of, not necessarily consciously, but we tend to kind of see things through that lens that support our ideas. So it's very hard for us to change our minds, right?
Yeah.
Because once we have this belief system and once we kind of see things through that lens, then everyone else that views things differently just seems wrong. Um, and I'm convinced, Jay, that's a lot of what's wrong with our country today. Is that we have people from very different belief systems, but they're unwilling to view the material without confirmation bias. And so then the other person is just wrong. They're seeing the same information, they're manipulating it, whatever. And but both parties wholeheartedly believe that they're right.
Yeah, it's hard because research on confirmation bias. So often we just look for stuff that supports our view, and so that's what we get flooded with. But even when we're presented with alternative evidence, when we have a strong belief in something, that alternative evidence, we're less likely to even remember it. So you might read something that goes against your own view on something, and then a week later you're less likely to remember that evidence or the details of it, or get things wrong. And it's not because you intentionally tried to. It's just
Right.
this is how our unconscious mind works. And
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
really important that we're very careful to try to correctly understand opposing views.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me. And yeah, you said it right. It's not intentional. I think a lot of times we see the other side, whatever side that may be, as kind of a caricature of who they really are. Um, but a large part of it's just the subconscious.
Yeah.
We don't realize we're doing this. We're not intentionally doing this, but it keeps us from being open minded and keeps us from being able to see evidence contrary to what we already believe. And so when you approach Christianity from that standpoint, you approached it kind of with this question. From my understanding, is why do people? And that course sounds fascinating. Was it psychology of religion? Is that what it
Yeah.
was? Yeah, that sounds. I'd love to take that course. Do you teach that course?
I haven't taught it yet, but I'm
Yeah,
hoping in a year or two we might offer it as a special topics and teach it, or maybe do a group teach
that's
um,
cool.
course with some of the other instructors here, because it is a Christian college. So
Yeah,
some of the other professors may want to teach that. But yeah, I'm hugely fascinated by that.
yeah. But I've interviewed several apologists, and I want to get to I want to define what apologetics is, because I haven't done that yet. Um, I've interviewed several apologists lately, and the same phrase keeps coming up. Christianity explains the world better than any other explanation. The Christian worldview explains the reality of what we see and how we experience the world better than any other worldview. Can you dig into that a little bit, and why, maybe what evidence you found that helped you reach that conclusion?
Yeah. So for me, a big part of what convinced me was the natural theology argument. So these
Yeah.
are arguments from looking at nature to see to kind of make the case for God generally, not specifically a Christian God, but that there had to be some sort of designer or creator. So, like cosmological arguments that would point to a creator, like the universe had to be created by something
Mm.
outside of itself. Um, Design arguments or teleological arguments that showing like the way the universe was put together in a very precise way. If the gravitational forces were just a little different, or
Mm.
if the universe is formed at a little different rate, or places or times, like we wouldn't have life. So those types of things were very convincing
Yeah.
for me, and kind of made it for me. It was hard to say, yes, this could happen naturally, but the probabilities are just so small. It's so unlikely that it, it seems to be a better explanation to say that God created it. And so once there's that foundation of
Mm.
God likely exists, then okay, well, whose version of God? What does that look like? And so the historical evidence for the resurrection and the reliability of the Gospels in particular seem to make more sense, along with, say, a moral framework. And I was never particularly drawn to the moral argument.
Mhm.
Uh, I know for a lot of people that, they can't let go of this idea that morality without God is just subjective opinion.
Yeah.
Um, so that wasn't something that necessarily played a role for me, but it did within a Christian context seem to work best for what we generally as a culture or world consider to be good or bad behavior, morally right or wrong behavior. And Christianity seemed to make more sense in that context.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And it does. Um, but a lot of times the caricature of Christians that is portrayed out there is that we have this blind faith. We're just going into it blind. But in reality, it takes more faith to believe the opposite, right? Like the probability that this world just kind of created from randomness takes a lot more faith to me than that there was a God that orchestrated it. And so once you made that realization, that I'm sure that was groundbreaking for you, right? Like, what were some of the feelings that you had? Like, man, I approached this and I was not necessarily expecting to find what I found, and now I've got to do something about my core belief system. What did that feel like?
Yeah, I'm for me, there weren't many emotions attached. I'm not a very emotional person, and
Yeah.
maybe you've already picked that up from this. I do have emotions for sure. I'm not, um, but just they're not very strong in me, and so especially when I get intellectually curious about something, and I try to just want to understand it.
Yeah.
Uh, but really, the one that I do recall feeling was really more surprise than
Mm.
anything, because I didn't think Christianity was true. I didn't think the arguments would be good once I heard them. I thought for sure atheists or other religious believers would have good responses to the arguments for Christianity, and so I was really surprised each step of the way that they weren't as good. They weren't able to refute, the arguments very well. Um, and so for me, it was at that point where I just felt like I reached a sort of endpoint or finishing whatever book or lecture I listened to at the time. It was just like, okay, well, I think this is the truth. And so
Mm.
you're going to be a Christian, and it doesn't make sense if Christianity is true, right? And the God of the universe inspired this book,
Mm.
and wants us to love him and follow him. Um, it doesn't make sense to do it half-heartedly. So I'm going to be all in. I'm going to be fully committed, and try to live by the book, and um, you know do that in a variety of different ways.
Awesome. So when you had this understanding and you reached this new basis for the framework of your belief system, you kind of, from what you explained to me, you're like, okay, well, more people need to understand this. And I'm sure that wasn't exactly immediate, but and so you decided that you wanted to go into ministry. Maybe God was calling you that way. Um, and so you got a degree in apologetics. And I know I'm fast forwarding through some of your story here, but for time's sake, I want to talk about apologetics because maybe people out there aren't familiar with that term. It kind of gets a bad rap sometimes. But apologetics is not apologizing for our belief. Matter of fact, it's the opposite of that. Um,
But it
but
does have the same root word in Greek.
yeah,
So apologia, and so that came to mean, it sort of branched out to mean like a rational defense, like apologetics or an apology, and that can be a little confusing. But if you think of if someone does something wrong to you and apologizes, right? You know, we appreciate that someone says I'm sorry, but a really good apology when someone says, I'm sorry, I'm sorry because X, Y, and Z, and so that they have not an excuse but a legitimate reason. Like that is a more heartfelt, sincere, maybe not more heartfelt, sincere apology, but it's more meaningful to us when we've been
mhm,
harmed. Right? If someone stands you up and late, they're like, I'm so sorry. I got in a car accident. Like we tend to be more quick to forgive or understanding in those situations, and that would be a much better apology, how we feel it, than someone, sorry I'm late, I just didn't care a whole lot, or I was
yeah.
busy.
So it's kind of the explanation. Uh,
Right.
and that's a really good explanation of what apologetics is. It's an explanation for why we believe the way we believe. And so, for those that may not be all that familiar with apologetics, can you kind of give us just a high level view of what that is and why you were so interested in going into that, and then why is apologetics important for the everyday believer? Because apologetics isn't just for people, you know, the pastors. It isn't just for those in ministry. It isn't just for those that are on platforms. I'm convinced that we as the church need to do a better job equipping our congregants for believing why they believe what they believe, explaining why they believe what they believe. But yeah, if you could help us with that, what is apologetics, and then what was your interest in that, and why is it important today?
Yeah. So apologetics, I use a very broad definition of it. So it would be, reasons or explanations for why we believe. Often it ends up usually being more of the rational, evidential reasons why we believe. So what's the historical evidence? What scientific evidence do we have? What are the philosophical arguments? And so a more intellectual pursuit, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And so
Yeah,
like experiencing or witnessing a miracle or hearing a testimony of a miracle, that would count as apologetics, and then some apologists will focus on that as well.
sure.
And so I take that broad lens. And for me, when I got into um, studying religions, I didn't even have a conception of how there could be evidence for a God. Like it didn't even
Mm,
seem to make sense, thinking in terms of like scientific evidence that we have is like how can we have any sort of evidence for God? And so
sure.
um, for me, that was one of those surprises. Like, oh, we can draw conclusions from the scientific evidence, or we do have historical evidence to show reliability of the Bible, things like that. So there was that level of surprise. And so for me, I'd never heard any of that. I didn't know that were true. And in fact, one of my things that kind of slowed down my progress and was a bit of a barrier to me becoming a Christian was, my grandparents were religious. I knew religious people. I visited churches with friends. And so I remember having the thought, if this evidence and these arguments are true, if they're valid, if they're good, this is all I would have heard about from all these different people.
Yeah,
That's what they would have talked about in their sermons because, it's real tangible evidence. And so my thought was, this is 22-year-old me at the time. Um, they're not preaching this, they're not talking about it because they know something I don't know. They know that it's
mm,
false, and
right.
they're at least trying to be honest, but they know it's false. And so
Yeah,
that was a bit of a hang up for me to do more steps to investigate it. And what I came to understand and realize is most people aren't even aware of it.
right.
And there's historical reasons for that, and particularly in our country. But so that was kind of a big motivating force for me in doing apologetics and wanting to do it. It's that a lot of people just don't know. They're not aware that there could be evidence. They're in that same boat I am. So they're not talking about it, using it, engaging it, trying to learn it because it just many of them don't know that exists. And
Hmm.
that's changed a lot over the last 20 years since I became a Christian. It's a lot more apparent, and more accessible. People hear about it more, even if they don't necessarily know or hear the word apologetics. They we'll hear more about evidence and arguments for God or Christianity. But that
Yeah.
was my big push and motivator, was trying to help bring awareness. And I actually started a ministry called Apologetics Awareness, which I passed on to someone else and moved because I wanted to help people be more aware that there can be reasons to believe. It's not just, oh, I feel, this is true. He's like,
Yeah.
well, do we have more? And,
Yeah.
and I try to be very clear with people that biblically, it doesn't matter why you believe. That's not
Right.
what saves us. And
Right.
so people can believe for all sorts of reasons, good, bad, or in the middle. That doesn't matter why we believe. But I do think it's helpful that the more reasons we have for belief, whether the intellectual, emotional, experiential, social, whatever it is, the more reasons we have for belief, that will strengthen our faith, and we'll
Mm.
see more fruit from that, and more joy that will come from that as well.
I really like that. Um, yeah, you can have faith, and you don't have to have reasons for it. That's not necessary. Come as you are. Um, and God doing a work inside of you isn't objective. It's not something we can measure. Um, the greatest miracle of all is inside the human heart, and how He changes us from the inside out, and we can't look at that and measure that. However, I think it helps us in times of doubt. And I think it helps us when we face a culture that's telling us that what you're believing is a lie, or that what you're believing is a fairy tale, or however they want to say it. It helps us to be able to say, no, I believe this because it's actually real, and it's not just some make believe game. It's not something I've been brainwashed into. I didn't check my brain at the door when I walked into church. Um, there are plenty of reasons to believe, but that's not necessary for true biblical belief. I love that distinction. That was really, really helpful.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like I sometimes, if you picture a bridge, right? You can walk blindfolded across a bridge, right? You have no reason to believe. You might not even know there's a bridge there. Someone might just say there's a bridge, walk across it, right? Or it could look like a ratty, old, beat up bridge, right? And you can still, going onto the bridge. That's the act of faith. That's faith, and you can look at the blueprints and watch it designed, and you're going to have more evidence that's going to hold you, right?
yeah,
But you don't need that, and we all come from it at a different perspective and different levels of what what counts as evidence for us, and if we're willing to trust that bridge and take the act of faith of walking across it or driving across it. And so um, the key though is did you go on the bridge? Were you able to use it? That's the faith part, and that's what's important.
yeah, yeah. You trust the bridge enough to walk on it. You trust the bridge enough to give your life to it because, hey, if that thing falls, you're going down with it. You don't have to understand the structure behind it. You don't have to be able to see all the supports that are there to make it a good bridge, to have faith in the bridge. However, when you're walking across that bridge and maybe it sways a little bit, uh, it helps to be able to say, you know what? No, the way that this is made, it allows for that wind shear, and okay, I understand that this is just part of it.
Yeah,
It's a really good explanation and a really good illustration. And so when you think about Christianity, and when you think about the fact that everyone's kind of in a different place in their walk with God, right? We're not ever like all together. I'm a young adult pastor, and so I get people when they graduate high school, age 18, and kind of help them through those formative years, college years, or when they go to trade school or go right into the career that they're after. But that's really a time in our life, and it was, college was kind of that time for you, it was that time for me as well, where we begin to make our faith our own. And so we do kind of, I think, naturally have that curiosity. Why do I believe what I believe? Do I believe that just because I was taught that, like we are the Bible Belt? I grew up, I went to children's church, I went to vacation Bible school, I was in a youth group. Okay, that's great. But now we need substance to it. We need to believe what we believe because we know that it's real. So what would you tell someone who is, and even if they're not in that age group, but different people are in different places with their walk. What would you tell someone as someone who understands both psychology uh, and religion and faith, who's wrestling with those doubts and trying to reconcile? Okay, well, if so many people in the culture tell me this doesn't exist, and if I'm having doubts of why would God allow this to happen? That kind of thing. What would be your advice to someone struggling through those times and wrestling with those times?
Yeah. So one, I tell people with this, doubt's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't take it as that or as a fearful thing, right? It, often can be a sign that you become more knowledgeable or grown in some ways, right? And so
Yeah.
keeping your faith up with that um, can sometimes take a little work.
Hmm.
Sometimes people not. I love the line from C.S. Lewis. It talks about doubt, and he says, when I was an atheist, there were a lot of times when I doubted atheism too.
Hmm.
And so whatever someone's religion or worldview is, they're probably going to have times where they doubt that it's true or the right one.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a unique thing for Christians, and that's okay. And so, um, again, what we know probably for most people is that having multiple anchors or ties to a belief is going to strengthen it. So,
Mm.
um, apologetics can be one of those things. Do you understand? We have good reasons for why the Bible is true, and that comes from a lot of different realms. And so,
Yeah.
some will appeal more to others than some people. So, um, I wasn't a big fan of the Christian sexual ethic, coming as a non-Christian with my upbringing,
Right.
but I've come to see research on that, empirical research that, fewer sexual partners tends to correlate with higher levels of happiness and lower
Mm.
levels of depression. And so sort of that confirmation that the biblical sexual ethic makes the most sense. It's what's best for our own interest. Right. And so that for some people might be like, oh wow, that's really important. But other people are like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. So finding what, those answers that you need is a big part of it. And it might be, all the different areas. It might just be one. So engaging in apologetics, I think, can be really helpful. It's often
Sure.
presented as this is just intellectual and it's not formative, but it's extremely formative
Hmm.
for people in lots of different ways. It has been in my life. And so learning is a big part of that, but also are you out living out your faith? Are you doing it? Are you around other believers, having conversations with them, hanging out with them, um, serving your community, doing these things and just living that life and making that a normal part of your life and doing that not with a negative attitude, but doing it with a positive attitude. So with my kids, we're always trying to get them to eat more fruits and veggies, right? So the rule we had, when they're doing something, trying to eat something they don't particularly like, it's, you're not going to have a lot of it, but just take a bite or a couple bites without complaining or putting much thought into it. Just make it part of a normal experience.
Yeah.
Because when we get really upset or angry about it and like, I can't believe I'm doing this, it's disgusting or terrible, right? That then conditions us to think that it's more of a negative thing than if we just sort of do it with a positive attitude or a neutral attitude. It just becomes normal and part of life, and we don't have those negative experiences, and that can start to build up a situation where we experience a lot more joy from it, and can be a positive experience. So, for example, like volunteering and serving at your church or even some other way. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a church. You look at that negatively. Oh, this is time. It's hard work. I don't want to do this. Yeah, that you have that perspective, it's going to be harder. But if you have the perspective is like, I get to help people and um, interact with other people and do something meaningful, right? You think about it that way, then that starts to become a joy and something you look forward to. And so thinking about faith or practicing faith in a way where, you're using your mind and your body in the sense of doing and following through with these things. I think having both actions can be really helpful.
Yeah. Um, we kind of came full circle, didn't we? Thought life matters. Your perspective when you do these things conditions your brain to react a certain way the next time, right? Um, and so being able to do that in a positive way sets yourself up for your brain to expect that to be a positive experience next time.
Yeah.
But the opposite is also true. You do something begrudgingly, and your brain's going to dread it next time, right? That really matters. And going back to what you said about science kind of playing out some of these truths. Um, I, science lags behind God, right? But I love it when science starts playing out what we know to be true. And so the scientific studies, the research that's done out there is starting to show that some of these call them mandates, ethics, whatever, that God gives us in the Bible actually result in, an improved quality of life. It's almost like God knew what he was doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the ones I like to use lately is this. I've seen a lot of science come out about gratitude journals, and even apart from religion, apart from faith, just gratitude journals. If you keep track of what you're thankful for, what you're grateful for, making that part of your everyday practice, you become a lot happier. You become a lot more of a positive person. And I think of the times in the scripture where we're commanded to, in all circumstances, give thanks. And I'm like, it's almost like God knew what he was doing there too. And so
Right.
science is kind of playing this out, and it's like, hey, you know what? All of these things, those things are good for us. And, we don't need to wait for the science to come out, but I love it when science verifies biblical truths. And
Yeah,
we're seeing more and more of that these days, it seems like.
for sure.
Um, well, Jay, you are a blessing. I appreciate you and your story and your voice. It's so important in our world today. Can you tell our listeners where to find out more about you and what you're doing and your story? And I know you're in a couple different places on social media as well.
Yeah, I've got Facebook, Instagram, X. Um, Not super active on those, not right now. I recently started Substack back up, so I hope to start writing a little more on there as well, and talking about some things with the intersection of psychology and Christian faith. And um, again, mostly that'll be on kind of apologetic stuff. How do we know Christianity is true? But
Mm.
even more broadly of you know parenting, maybe something, because that's related to psychology, and so
Yeah,
at that from a biblical lens, or what um, Christians kind of culture talks about or discusses in that. Critical thinking part of it, and so how do we apply that critical thinking to faith or different faith claims, whether it's within Christian circles or outside that. So that's the plan, and hopefully I'll start being consistent on there, and writing, and yeah, that would be the place to go, and pretty easy to find.
awesome. Um, if you'll send me the link to that Substack, I'll put that in the show notes.
Okay.
And I'll put links to your socials there too. But Jay, you're a gift. Thank you so much for being here, spending some time with us today, and telling us your story, but encouraging us in our faith. And I just want to say to our listeners out there, if you find yourself in the Christian world and you find yourself following Jesus, I want to encourage you that you don't have to check your brain at the door. Uh, Christianity is true, and there are so many reasons and so many ways in which that lines up. And so I want to encourage you to seek that out for yourself. Jay's doing great work in this field. And then if you're out there and you're struggling, maybe you haven't come to faith yet, you have doubts, you have questions. I want to encourage you to wrestle with those too. Those are normal. And I want to encourage you to have an open mind, to do away with the confirmation bias that we talked about earlier in this show. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'll have Jay's info there too. Reach out to him. I'm sure either one of us will be able to help you through those and guide you towards the truth. But thank you, Jay. Thank you, listeners. What a great episode this has been. And I can't wait to connect with you again soon, Jay. Thank you, brother.
Thank you.